It was Paul Halmos who said, "The only way to learn mathematics is to do mathematics." Hello, boys and girls. My name is Miss Aaliyah Brewster, and it's time for us to do grade 5 mathematics. If you would join me as we go through the concept of time, so grab a notebook and a pencil, get settled. It's time for us to start. Are you ready? Because I'm ready. Let's begin. I always like to begin my lesson with a warm-up exercise. For today's warm-up activity, we'll recite the 4 times table. So if you would join me, let's begin. 4 times 0 is 0. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 3 is 12. 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 5 is 20. 4 times 6 is 24. 4 times 7 is 28. 4 times 8 is 32. 4 times 9 is 36. 4 times 10 is 40. 4 times 11 is 44. 4 times 12 is 48. Let's move on to the questions surrounding the 4 times table. We'll begin with, what is 4 times 6? What is 4 times 6? The answer there, of course, would be 24. Next question. What would be the product of 4 and 4? What would be the product of 4 and 4? The product of 4 and 4 is 16. Of course, here the word product is being substituted for multiplication. So whenever you hear product, you should know that they're asking you to multiply. The other question is, how many 4s are in 40? How many 4s are in 40? There are 10 4s in 40, or in other words, 10 times 4 is equivalent to 40, or 4 times 10 is equivalent to 40. The last question is, complete the number sequence. Complete the number sequence. 4, 8, 12, 16. What would come next in the number sequence after 16? Of course, 20 would come next, because if you notice, the number sequence are actually the multiples of 4. So the next logical number to complete that sequence would be 20. Thank you for participating in our warm-up exercise. Let's dive into a short story. Today's story is named Time is Gold by Quick Pit Short Stories. This is the story of a lazy man who was a friend of a king. One morning, the lazy man asked the king, "Why everyone says that I can't do anything? And even when I go to get a proper job, everyone refuses me. My enemies have told everyone that I've never done any work on time." The king said, "Let's make a deal. Before sunset, you must come to my treasury and collect as much gold and pearls as you can. They will be all yours." The man rushed towards his home to his wife. He explained everything, and then after hearing the husband, the wife said, "Go and get the gold and gems now. Time is gold for you." The lazy man sat down and said, "I can't go now. Give me lunch first. After having lunch, he decided to take a nap, but instead slept for 2 hours. Then late in the afternoon, he picked a few bags and went towards the king's treasury. On the way, he felt hot, so he sat down under a tree to rest and ended up sleeping for another 5 hours. When he finally reached the palace, it was already late in the evening. It was time for sunset. Therefore, the palace gates had been shut before he could reach there. He lost the golden chance to get rich just because he didn't know the value of the time. The moral of the story is time is precious. Therefore, we should spend it wisely and stop wasting time on unimportant things. Now we'll move on to understanding how to tell time. And if you look on the screen, you would notice I have a giant clock there. Now that clock has the 3 hands that are usually on every clock. So the first hand, it's called the second hand. That's the longest hand there on the clock. Now that hand moves the most, and in fact it moves the fastest. So every tick, every movement is actually a second being passed. And then we have the other hand, which would be the minutes hand, or sometimes we refer to it as the long hand. That hand, it moves not as fast as the second hand, but every time the second hand goes around the clock, that minute hand moves 1 place, right? Remember that every time the second hand goes around the clock, the minute hand moves 1 place. The shortest hand there on the clock is called the hour hand, and that hand, of course, is used to tell the hours. So the hours on the clock would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Now, every time the minute hand goes around the clock, the hour hand moves 1 place, right? It moves 1 place and it changes. So if the hour is 3 o'clock, as the minute hand goes around the clock and it comes back to where it began, the hour hand will change to 4 and the time will be 4 o'clock. Now to understand this better, we'll look at it by examining the units of time. So it says here that 60 seconds is equivalent to 1 minute. 60 seconds is equivalent to 1 minute. So what that's simply saying is a clock actually has 60 seconds around it, right? If you look very closely there on the clock I have on the screen, you'll see it's numbered from 1 to 60. So every time that second hand goes around and it reaches back to where it began, 1 minute has passed because 60 seconds has gone by. Now, it says here that 60 minutes is equivalent to 1 hour. 60 minutes is equivalent to 1 hour. This simply means that when the minute hand goes around the clock and it reaches back to that place where it began, 1 hour would have passed, or 60 minutes would have passed, right? So in that way, the hour would change from 1 hour to another hour. Let's say, for example, it started at 1 o'clock and the minute hand goes around the clock and 60 minutes would have passed. Then the time would be 2 o'clock. The other concept we would examine is that 24 hours is equivalent to 1 day. So once 24 hours would have passed, meaning that the shorthand went around the clock twice. So it made an entire rotation twice, 2 times around the clock. That means a day would have passed. Now we'll move on to doing an activity that will help us to better understand how to tell the time. Now, if you look on the screen, you would notice there are a total of 8 clocks there. So we'll examine each clock individually and see if we can tell the time. The first clock, of course, you'll see the long hand is pointing at 3, and the long hand there is the minute hand, while the short hand is pointing at 12, and the short hand tells the hour. So whenever we're writing time, the first few digits would be the hour, while the digits that proceed after the colon would be the minutes. So therefore, the hour would be 12 o'clock, while the minute would be 15. Now 15 there is actually representing or showing and telling us that 15 minutes would have passed after 12 o'clock. So we would say 12:15 is the time they're representing on that first clock. Now if you look at the clock that is right next to that one, you would notice that the long hand is pointing at 7, while the short hand or the hour hand is pointing at 3. Now there, of course, we would write 3 in the space that is allocated for the hour, and after the colon we put 35. We put 35 because we noticed that the long hand was pointing at 7. Now on the clock, all the time the minutes are represented in fives, in groups of fives, right? So if you start from 1 there, if the minute hand is pointing at 1, we wouldn't say it's 12:01, we would say it's 12:05, right? So 1 would represent 5, and then 2 would be 10, 3 would be 15, 4 would be 20, 5 would be 25, 6 would be 30, 7 would be 35, 8 would be 40, 9 would be 45, 10 would be 50, 11 would be 55, and 12 would be 60. So remember we discussed that 60 minutes equal to 1 hour. So the 60 minutes there is actually being divided into 5. So each number on the clock is being represented by 5, or it's representing 5 minutes. So now we can go back to the second clock. So there we would notice that the time would be 3:35, right? Because the long hand is pointing at 7, and 7 there would represent that 35 minutes would have passed. Now we'll move on to the third clock, and if you notice, the minute hand is pointing at 9, while the hour hand is pointing at 5. Now the time there would be 5:45. You might ask yourself, how did we arrive at 45? We arrived at 45 simply because the minute hand is pointing at 9, and 9 represents that 45 minutes would have passed after the hour. So therefore, the time would be 5:45. Now we can move on to the fourth clock, and you would notice that the minute hand is pointing to 6, while the hour hand is pointing to 11. Therefore, the time would be 11:30. Of course, we arrived at 11 because the hour is 30, the hour hand is clearly pointing at 11, while the minute hand is pointing at 6, and 6 there represents that 30 minutes would have passed after the hour. Now we'll move on to the bottom row. The first clock on the bottom row, the minute hand is pointing at 5, while the hour hand is pointing at 1. The time there, of course, would be 1:25. And of course, we arrived at 25 by looking at the minute hand. Because the minute hand is pointing at the numeral 5, we can count. If you count from 1, you count from 5. So you start 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So the time there would be 1:25. We'll move on to the second clock on the bottom row. There you have the minute hand is pointing at 2, while the hour hand is pointing at 9. Therefore, the time there would be 9:10. And we arrived at 10 because the minute hand is pointing at 2, and 2 there represents 10. Now we'll move on to the third clock on the bottom row. There you have the minute hand is pointing at 10, while the hour hand is pointing at 8. Therefore, the time would be 8:50 because 10 there represents that 50 minutes would have passed after the hour. Now we'll move on to the fourth clock, and you would notice that the minute hand is pointing at 5, while the hour hand is pointing at 7. Therefore, the time there would be 7:25. Moving on, we'll be examining time further by looking at a calendar. On the screen, you would notice that I have a calendar there depicting the month of January, the year 2021. Of course, you know, boys and girls, that 7 days make 1 week. And the week begins at Sunday and it ends at Saturday. Now, the days of the week are, of course, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Now, the calendar usually has the days of the week imprinted at the top so that we can keep track of each date. In that way, you would know that 7 days, of course, equals to 1 week, while 4 weeks equals to 1 month. Now, how did we arrive at 4 weeks equaling to 1 month? You look at the calendar, you would notice that, as mentioned, we say a full week. It starts at Sunday and it ends at Saturday. So week 1 started on the 3rd and it ended on the 9th of January, while week 2, of course, started at the 10th and it ended on the 16th. And then we have the 3rd week starting at the 17th, on the 17th, and the 4th week starting on the 24th. And of course, there are no other weeks. There's only 4 weeks in a month. Now we'll continue with time, diving further to understand the concept even better. Now, what you need to know, boys and girls, is that 12 months makes 1 year. 12 months makes 1 year. So if you look on the screen, you would notice that I have a yearly calendar. A yearly calendar, it depicts the months of the year. So the year begins at January, then we have February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December, right? Now, 1 year makes 52 weeks, or in other words, 52 weeks makes up 1 year. So if we add each week for each month, it will be a total of 52 weeks that makes a year, right? Now, some of you might wonder how many days make 1 month. Now, to understand how many days make 1 month, we'll examine a poem that I learned while I was at primary school, and I would like to pass this knowledge on to you. So the poem goes like this. 30 days have September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31 days, except for February alone, which has 28 days and 29 days in a leap year. So remembering the poem that we just recited, you would notice it says 30 days have September, April, June, and November. Now, if you look at the yearly calendar on the screen, you can see that indeed September has 30 days, April has 30 days, June has 30 days, November has 30 days. And all the other months besides September, April, June, and November, all the other months have 31 days. That includes January, of course, March, May, July, August, October, and December. Now, February is one exception. That's a special month because on a regular year, February has 28 days. However, if we have a leap year, February would have 29 days. You might be wondering, what is a leap year? Now, a leap year is a calendar year that contains an additional day added to it. So a traditional or a normal year has 365 days. But when we have a leap year, this occurs every 4 years. Extra day is added to February. So instead of having 365 days, we have 366 days when it's a leap year. Okay? Now you can try an activity on your own. If 7 days make 1 week, calculate the following. 1, how many days make 2 weeks? And number 2, how many days make 3.5 weeks? Did you get all correct? Let's check. If 7 days make 1 week, to calculate how many days make 2 weeks, we multiply 7 by 2, or we can add 7 plus 7 because we're looking at 2 weeks. Of course, the answer there would be 14 days makes 2 weeks. Number 2, we were asked to identify how many days make 3.5 weeks. Now to do this, I divided the mixed number, and first we will calculate how many days are in 3 weeks by multiplying 3 by 7. That would be 21 days. Then we will identify how many days are in half of a week. Okay? How many days are in half of a week? So of course, a week has 7 days. Okay? Now half of 7 would be 3.5. But when we're looking at time, we can't just say 3.5 days. We say 3 days and 12 hours because half of a day, remember, each day has 24 hours. So if we're going to say half of a day, we say 12 hours. So in that way, the answer would be 3.5 weeks is equivalent to 24 days and 12 hours. Right? 24 days and 12 hours. Now we'll move on to converting units of time. Converting may sound like a fancy word to you or a big word, but it simply means to change. So throughout this lesson here, we'll be changing one unit of time to another unit of time. The units of time are, of course, seconds, hours, minutes, days, months, and years. When we are asked to change a small unit of time to a bigger unit of time, we must divide. For example, suppose we're asked to convert 120 seconds to minutes. In fact, they're asking us to convert a small unit of time to a bigger unit of time. Therefore, we divide. To do this, we must first remember that 60 seconds equal 1 minute. Now, if you remember that 60 seconds equal to 1 minute, it's easier for you to divide and to find the answer. In this case, we divide 120 by 60. To do this, you can set it up as a fraction whereby 120 is the numerator and the denominator would be 60. We can cancel out the 2 zeros, the 1 from the 120 and the 0 from the 60. And what we'll have left is 12 above 6. You ask yourself, how many 6s are in 12? How many 6s are in 12? You know that 2 6s make 12, or 6 plus 6 equals to 12. Therefore, 2 would be the answer. So 120 seconds equals to 2 minutes. Now we'll do another example. In this example, we'll be examining what we must do when we're asked to change a big unit of time to a smaller unit of time. To do this, we must multiply. For example, suppose we're asked to convert 5 minutes to seconds. We must first remember that 1 minute is equivalent to 60 seconds. Therefore, to calculate how many seconds are in 5 minutes, we multiply 5 by 60. When we multiply 5 by 60, we will get 300. Therefore, 5 minutes is equivalent to 300 seconds. Now we'll move on to solving problems with time. The problem we'll be looking at today is Sharon left the house at 7 a.m. for work. She took the bus that picked her up from home. It then traveled for 30 minutes. What time did Sharon arrive at work? find out what time Sharon arrived at work, we will examine it by looking at the picture on the screen. If you notice, the time of departure, meaning the time that Sharon left home, was 7 a.m. If you look on the first clock, you would notice that that clock there is depicting 7 a.m. because the minute hand is pointing at 12, while the hour hand is pointing at 7. When she left home at 7 a.m., she then took the bus, and the journey from home to work took a total of 30 minutes. Now, if we are to do it manually by counting 30 minutes after the hour, we would be able to find out the time that Sharon reached at work. So here we have the minute hand is pointing at 12 at the time she left. After 30 minutes, the minute hand would not remain at 12. In fact, it would move 30 minutes. For it to move 30 minutes, it would move to 1, which would represent 5 minutes would have passed. Then it'll move to 2, 10 minutes would have passed. 3, 15 minutes. 4, 20 minutes. 5, 25 minutes. And then at 6, 30 minutes. Therefore, the long hand would have moved from 12 to 6. And the time there would be 7:30 a.m. So it took Sharon 30 minutes to reach the work. However, she reached the work at 7:30 a.m. Here is another way to solve the same problem. I'll read over the problem. Sharon left the house at 7 a.m. for work. She took the bus that picked her up from home. It then traveled for 30 minutes. What time did Sharon arrive at work? To solve the problem another way, we can set up 2 columns, one for hours and one for minutes, and then we can add. What do we add? We add the time of departure and the time it took to complete the journey. In this case, the time of departure would have been 7 a.m. or 7 o'clock. Therefore, under the hour column, we put 7, and under the minutes, we put 0 because it's just 7 o'clock. There are no minutes past that hour. The journey took a total of 30 minutes. Therefore, we put 30 below the minutes column. We can then add the hours, then we add the minutes. The hours would be 7 hours, so we write 7 at the bottom. The minutes would be 30 minutes, so we write 30 at the bottom. Therefore, the time of arrival, of course, is 7 hours 30 minutes, which is 7:30 a.m. Thank you, boys and girls, for tuning in to today's lesson. Remember, the only way to learn mathematics is to do mathematics. Therefore, you must continue to practice even after our study time has come to an end. I do hope you would have enjoyed today's lesson. Goodbye.